So I get energized by growth in markets, partially driving the growth, but then building the capability in organizations and teams that actually capture that growth.
That's Joachim Ackermann, Managing Director of Global Product Partnerships at Google in Asia Pacific. Joachim has spent the last decade at the forefront of Google's meteoric growth in the region. I'm Allison Eyring, organization psychologist, CEO, and endurance athlete. I've spent the last 25 years helping companies solve the people and organizational challenges of growth. I've worked with all types of CEOs and business leaders across the world, but it takes a special type of leader to successfully grow a business. I call them growth leaders. These leaders have an edge for growth. This allows them to drive performance today while transforming their business for tomorrow and still keeping their people energized. Growth Leaders is my new podcast where I'll show you what it takes to successfully lead business growth in conversations with some of the best growth leaders I know. In this interview with Joachim, I was interested to get a better understanding of how a growth leader operates at what is one of the most innovative and fast-growing companies of the 21st century. So Joachim, thank you so much for being here today. It's great to talk to you.
Thanks for having me.
Now, I would like to start by asking you to tell me about your first job. The unofficial
first job, that's a long time ago. I think it was age 14 or 15, and I worked in a brewery in a department that received used and dirty and half-filled kegs, beer kegs, and they had to be first washed, and that was my job.
You received them, you didn't have to wash them?
No, I washed them.
Oh, okay.
Yes, with a brush.
Excellent.
And there was metal kegs, so your hands were wet and had all the metal pieces in it.
And where were you? Where did you grow up?
Oh, that was in the southern part of Germany.
And now you're living in Singapore?
Now I live in Singapore, yes.
How long have you been here?
Been here 15 years.
And where were you before?
I was before 7 years in New York, in the US, and before that I was almost 2 years in Istanbul, in Turkey.
Nice, very nice cities.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about your role and what does driving growth mean to you?
I've had and have many roles. They cover mostly commercial, initially, businesses, advertising businesses, and now recently they cover our user products. These are applications and services on the web or on a mobile that probably everyone is familiar with and using, starting from search to AI-driven assistant, maps or news products.
You're in an area of a lot of growth. Do you see yourself as a growth leader? And what does that mean to you?
Yeah, I see myself as a growth and change leader. And the way I look at it is kind of what you're asking. There has two elements. One is growth and the other one is leader, and they're kind of different. So I get energized by growth in markets, partially driving the growth, but then building the capability in organizations and teams that actually capture that growth. I also had roles, and we have parts of business where we're not necessarily the leader. So growth, that means that in my mind that you actually get a growth premium over the market. That's the real challenge, the ultimate kind of true north.
So what does that mean, a growth premium over the market?
That if the market grows at, let's say, 30%, you need to be growing more than 30.
Even when you think about growth, you think you use an external benchmark.
Yeah, it's a relative market share concept.
Yeah.
You need to get more than your fair share. And we have business, and I've worked in other companies and other business where we did not have that premium. And that was the emphasis to get back to premium levels.
Which is, I think that's a very interesting observation, because you look at what drives growth, and external orientation is one of the biggest drivers of growth. And so even just having this idea of what is growth with an external orientation, I think is a really powerful one.
I think it's an anchor point, and very often it gets lost too much. And it's very simple, and it's uniting across organizations because there's only one external reality, while there are different perspectives, especially within organizations. So the other one, you asked for growth leader. I want to get to the second part as well, which is the leader and the leadership. In my mind, that's angles there are, it's very important to have everyone on board on the vision or aspiration, if kind of you break it down. And then you role modeling it with your own kind of in your own area, but that typically, in my experience, has limited kind of scale, and therefore you need to scale through and with others. And that's kind of, I think, that second part of growth, being a growth leader.
Say more about that, because I think that's such an interesting concept about scaling yourself. So you're somebody who has been in high growth markets and high growth businesses. And so you have to be constantly growing and learning. How do you do that?
Couple of facets. So one, scouting for the opportunities and being kind of very selective in picking them. And then be aligned around them because you can't do it alone. And then typically the way what we do and what my teams then do is seeding and learning and testing. And you do it actually in the markets and you iterate from there, which in our line of business is easier, doable than if you have a large supply chain or something that becomes a little more tricky, although you can find your way there to do that as well. And then you have a value proposition established, it's the seeding part, and then you can work on more the operational, what would it take, and the capability part. And then in my mind, there's a third phase, which is then completely scaling it up. In our organizational context, that usually means that we're handing it into countries for complete scale, and we're supporting the countries. That's usually, if you look at the curve from seeding to establishing to scaling, that's the third phase. In my typical role, I do the first two, and then lift it over and help the other teams to bring it to the next level.
So you sound to me like you're describing like growth hacking. Like you kind of have your idea, you're putting it out there, you're testing it, you're seeing what works, and then you're doing that with a number of different things. And then the thing, I guess that's why you call it seeding, because the thing that looks like it's got some legs, it's going to grow, then that's what you pull out and try to then execute.
Yeah, I think there's an element of hacking early on, then over time it becomes a little more institutional.
Yeah, exactly.
In the overall sense.
So you're describing the business activity. What about scaling people? What have you learned as a leader of growth about how do you scale people as the business is growing?
Scaling people has to do, in my mind, with capabilities and experiences. It's learning new capabilities to do things different, stepping back versus execution, finding ways to scale. For example, if you want to, you can execute 10 deals, but then you're at the end. But if you have to get 30 done, how you do it? You can use with an aggregator. That is a capability and a reflection and a thinking and thought leadership that allows you to do more. That's, in my mind, a capability-driven scaling. The other one, and I've personally experienced that myself, and I see many others going through it through a lot of different experiences and going into uncharted territories, dealing with ambiguity, where you need to leverage your capability set, you leverage your network, and probably a lot of learning because you realize this didn't work, that doesn't work, and then reflecting on it, why did it not work? Because it could work in another instance, so really getting deeper into insights of success or failure.
I think the experience with newness is a really interesting comment, because one of the things that I've seen in emerging markets is often people that come from developed markets struggle with this because they know how to grow a business when they have the infrastructure in place. But when there's lots of newness, they struggle with that.
Yeah, and I think the trick there is that's very hard to, in these contexts, very hard to outsmart. I think it's more experience-led. We just kind of test out and learn. And in a very sophisticated market, very well established structures, really understanding that dynamic and being very thoughtful, using established market capabilities, supply chains or go-to-markets or partnerships or ecosystems versus in a place where it's not established. That's why I think there's a different approach.
Right. Yeah, because you're building the business as you're also building the infrastructure for the business. So
yeah, you do it in parallel.
You
do it in parallel, more or less.
More complex.
Yeah.
I know that in Google and many companies also aspire to do this. You have a philosophy you call 10X. Say a little bit more. What does 10X mean?
10X is a philosophy. It's a mindset of thinking big and bold, thinking unconstrained, and doing that on things that really matter in a large scale. So it's a mindset and a philosophy over it. I give you an example from a different business which I worked on before. That business was growing 28%. And the leader was challenged with, we need 90% next year. And the leader then stepped back and said, oh, that's what you want us to do. Then I need to really reflect, and we need to find totally different ways to do this. And that was exactly the 10x notion. And the leader thought through a different go-to-market, how to scale differently, how to accelerate, et cetera, et cetera. And this team amazingly achieved 80-something% growth, which they would have not otherwise. They would have done more the incremental approach, which is I've done 28 last year. Now next year I do 31. How great is this? Which is also wonderful achievement, but it doesn't get to the 80 and plus, and it shows how a growth mindset actually could make a massive difference.
Right. So I'm really interested in this because you said you want to be big and bold on what really matters. How do you make that decision? How do you know what really matters?
So there are a couple of things. When you say you, I don't take it personal. I take it as we as a collective team. To me, that's almost like sports. It's not a necessarily running sport like in the book, but it's a team sport. So when you say you, to me, it's an inclusive we. And then the other one, very clearly, it's a portfolio approach where you pick a broader set of opportunities or areas, and there's a lot of ambiguity, and it's not clear which one will and which one will not succeed. So therefore, having a portfolio is really, really important. And each of the opportunities could be a hockey stick, which is usually something many business people don't like too much. But if you have a large portfolio of many hockey sticks, if just 2 or 3 go, then the whole portfolio goes. But you need to seed sufficiently broad.
Right.
I think the challenge is often that I've seen many instances where this kind of the 2 opportunities that are left over and they're now hockey stick, and that's a very high risk.
Exactly. It's interesting because one of the ideas I talk about in my book, Pacing for Growth, is about having an abundance mindset. And usually when I think about an abundance mindset, it's around looking at opportunities for development and thinking about talent. But I think you're describing an abundance mindset when it comes to having a portfolio of growth opportunities and really thinking about those and using that as a way to mitigate risk. So
Yes.
I think that's a great way of applying that concept of an abundance mindset.
Yeah. If I would look at the different businesses, there are some businesses or some markets that obviously are very opportunity rich, and there are some other places or industries that on the first glance probably have less opportunity. But I think the mindset and the principle applies. To grow, 3 to 5% over a market that's consolidating is also amazing. It's just a different concept. So I just want to clarify that it doesn't necessarily need to be in markets that are growing 100% year over year, that you can apply that.
Now, Google is clearly very, very good at innovation, but I wanted to know more about the psychology behind how growth leaders approach entrepreneurialism and innovation to drive business growth regardless of the organization. So I spoke to psychologist Dr. Tomas Chamorro-Premusek, a world-renowned specialist in personality, people analytics, and leadership development.
A lot of the characteristics that these leaders have are common to good leaders in general. You know, if you think about people who perform well in leadership roles, including those that require growth, I mean, these leaders tend to be more competent, so they have technical expertise, they have better people skills, they have more integrity, and they're self-aware. You know, and so maybe that makes up 60 or 70% of the variability in quality between leaders. And then, yes, I would say, second point, there are some characteristics that are more specific to growth leadership. And that's to be more entrepreneurial, so having the ability to translate creative ideas into actual innovations, you know, and I would say organizations are generally awash with ideas. There's no shortage of creativity, but what they lack is the ability to translate these into actual innovative solutions or products or services. So you do have in growth leaders more entrepreneurship, high levels of entrepreneurship. Sometimes we describe them as intrapreneurs when they function like entrepreneurs in residence or entrepreneurs in corporations. And then I think they also have higher levels of curiosity. And maybe another quality is higher levels of resilience as well, because whether you're going very fast or not so fast, growth should be a long-term objective and a long-term process, and you need to cope with setbacks and bounce back. So you have to be especially resilient.
So say a little bit more about being entrepreneurial, because I think that's really interesting, because there's a kind of an element of risk taking, and we often will work with very large organizations that seem to have bred out risk taking or a tolerance for much risk. So what happens when you're in an organization that's been around for a long time and you don't have a profile of leaders who can take risks or who have that? Is it an innate thing, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think what would happen is it's more likely that these organizations then fall down the inevitable kind of path of entropy and shrinkage, and we often hear that innovation leads to growth, but it is also true that growth hinders innovation. As organizations become more successful, they're also more likely to become a victim of their own success. I would say, there are only two bad moments for innovation. One is when things are going bad because you focus on, kind of how do we keep the lights on, and we have too much pressure and stress to actually think about innovation. The other is when things are going well, because if they're going well, why should I change? And so really all times are generally the enemy of innovation, and growth leaders can break this natural resistance that there is to innovation and actually drive growth and entrepreneurship forward.
So it sounds like organizations also need biodiversity.
Absolutely, exactly. That's a nice way of putting it.
Working in such a high growth environment, I wanted to find out more about how Joachim manages pace. Now, one thing that I know about you is that you also are a triathlete. In fact, I think maybe a couple times ago, I saw you in a race in Indonesia.
Yes, that was my first triathlon.
Your first triathlon, yes. Awesome.
Tested the waters.
And it was a good race. So I know that you have the discipline, you know how to train. I want to ask you a little bit about pace, not in the race, but as a leader. Tell me about a time as a leader when you found that you went too fast, and what did you do? How did you discover that you'd gone too fast, and how did you handle that?
I think going too fast in my mind has two different areas, and I was in that trap, I think, in each single one, probably a couple of times. One is when you come in a new situation and you analyze quickly and you get very clear, very quickly actually, what the dynamic is and which direction you need to go take. And going too fast means turning immediately into, okay, let's make it happen, and going down the execution path without sufficient engagement on other stakeholders. To test out your own view, but in particular also to have a joint inclusive we that's driving that. And that means probably if you go back to marathon running, that means your first kilometer is probably way too fast and the last 7 you kind of barely make it. That's kind of the point around having quickly direction, but not engaging more broad. That's category 1. I think there's a category 2, which I also experienced, is the organizational readiness around capabilities. Even if you have alignment on the direction where you want to go broadly as a team, it doesn't mean that all the capabilities are in place. And therefore, reflecting thoroughly on what it takes and building that up is important. Otherwise, you just don't make it at the end.
I love what you're saying, because so often I talk to leaders, or I'm working with leaders who insist they don't have time to engage people. And what I'm hearing from you is it's all about we, that you can't grow unless everyone, or the key people that are involved in that growth, are aligned and focused and ready to be a part of that.
Yeah, I would reflect as a leader, you need to spend a lot of time engaging with people in different modes, listening or just communicating or debating or aligning or agreeing to disagree, which also might happen sometimes. Obviously, there is an element of execution. There's teams that somebody is leading and somebody needs to execute. So you need to find the right mix in between. And I think it's overall a team sport as well. That's less running or triathlon. That's more like a football or team sport where different people have different roles to play, and you only win if everyone is in and wins. If a team loses 10-0, but there was this one amazing kind of person, then that's great, but that's not success.
Right.
So I kind of look at this as a team sport and the different roles, but the leader is clearly responsible for a lot of engaging with people.
Well, I want to ask you a question about culture, because you talked about the importance of having dialogue and even disagreeing and arguing. Now, you're German. Germans, on average, tend to be more direct, maybe than other cultures. So you've been in Asia for 15 years, where norms might be to be less direct. How do you find the right level of directness?
That's a very good question. And just reflecting on it, I recently did one of these cultural tests just to see how I calibrate to the bell curve of norms within a German context in which I grew up, and then different cultures that I experience and work with every day, think Japanese or Indian or Chinese or Southeast Asian. So I think the way I learn, is really reflecting and learning on yourself. So I think I'm more mellow German. By now, probably has developed over time, but still there's, what I also learned is it's kind of the relative gap to the other culture. It might be not a country, might be just an individual as well. So it's a lot of consciousness in the engagement and a lot of discipline in listening first. And I'm not saying that I'm necessarily the role model. It's a constant journey we need to work on it and make it very conscious in the activity and not just natural, because then you kind of do different behaviors and teasing it out or using partially also others. The example, if you engage in a culture that doesn't want to be as direct and wants to be more in local language, and I have my limited skill set there, I don't need to be in all the sessions personally. Again, it goes back to the team sport. Somebody else could play that role, and then we tag and reconnect it back together. So there are different tools to do that.
Talk to me a little bit about the opposite side, where you said, you talk about the needing to not go too fast. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you felt like you were going too slow? And what was that situation?
Usually when I run marathon, I'm going too slow. Yeah. In a business context, as I reflect on it, I'm typically a person who's kind of high energy, high pace, and if I have one kind of risk factor, it's probably going too fast and too intuitive, which means too early. So I usually not in the category of too slow, except there is a piece where I'm mentally in disagreement and somebody else thinks mentally different, but that's a different type of category I think you're talking to or about, where I've seen situations too slow, either in my team or in previous kind of experiences. I can maybe kind of reflect on these. What I see there is, in my team, then I reiterate the vision and ensure the vision is kind of aligned, and then set expectations on this is what we need to achieve in this time frame, which then picks up urgency over time, or also if the urgency is not picked up, then I question the growth mindset, and after coaching and supporting, et cetera, at some point in time, further action, then maybe changing leaders is kind of what needs to happen there.
Talk to me a little bit about routines. I think that certainly when we do in sports, any kind of endurance sport, you start to use routines both to save energy as well as to build new capabilities. What are some routines that you've used as a leader to make it easier to drive growth?
Yeah, in line with what I said earlier, to get more reflective early on the process and then drive the right engagements and be thoughtful about that. My routine is typically per week, at least once a week, I have a time block for myself, and I go into a small room with a whiteboard and I just do a mind map and map out the things that are top of mind, that are key priorities, and then build from there on what needs to happen. And when you see it, it drives the reflection, and I come out of that usually very clear. And that's a routine that I've built over the last couple of years, which is very helpful.
What made you start using that routine?
I think in particular feedback from other people around more engaging earlier, a desire to engage more earlier on and be part of the process and understand the process, made me then reflect that I need to spend time thinking through this some more.
Maybe because if you're thinking about it, you're running fast, and then they're not able to run with you because they don't understand what the big picture is.
Yeah.
They've got no map.
The other one which helps, if you do rotations and you just step in other people's shoes, then you get a broader perspective, which helps you reflect. And there could also be programs or just hearing from others on how they think about problems. So it's about being more inquisitive and then reflective.
Now, one of the concepts that I wrote about was about capacity. And I know you and I have had conversations before about maximum capacity. And I want you to describe a time when you knew your business was at its maximum capacity. So it was really performing at the highest level that it could with existing resources. And how did you know that you were at maximum capacity, and then what did you do about it?
It happens quite often. The way I think about it is there's a couple of symptoms in which you can find out or get a good sense, and then take corresponding actions. And you have in every team, there's a moment where somebody is sick or goes on a vacation, et cetera, et cetera. And if you see that happening and there's good collaboration in the team, but things start falling through the cracks, you know that team is maxed. On a business team where the situation where super high growth, it was maxed in terms of what it was doing because the next resource or team member would have not accelerated the growth. So you could see there was patching them. The other one we did recently, my team, was actually just really mapping out everyone on what the objectives are and what's the capacity needed and how much unplanned is coming. And if you add it all up, then you get a oversubscribe. I think we ended up at 170%. And that clearly indicates that's not stretching anymore, that's not sustainable. And probably with that one also the risk there's too much short-term happening because you're not building for the longer term capabilities, or some things have ramps or build a relationship and then you engage. So what we did there was prioritize ruthlessly and also consider a good mix of immediate things to accomplish this quarter, this year versus what is longer term. And again, to be mindful about what's the right mix. And obviously the other part is then a request for more capacity or headcount. In our notion and in other business I've been in, there is usually an expectation around scalability. So you need to have a headcount productivity that's ever increasing. So you need to be constantly thinking about how to be more productive. So that capacity is not linear in terms of its delivery over time.
So you started out and the signal was when you actually counted up all the time it would take, you were like 170%, almost double your max, what would be 100%. So what's an acceptable level?
I was trying to set the aspiration in spirit of 10x to 70 to 80% because the rest is unplanned and will come and you need to have time to react to it or be spontaneous. Realistically, we ended up around 110. Which at the time from 170 I think was in a greener zone. I still feel like we should get more towards 90 because everyone needs also space for spontaneous creativity and things show up, and therefore something below 100 is the right approach.
Right. Yeah,
there will be it's on average. It's not probably every day or every week. It's on average over a certain reasonable time frame. That's the way I think about it. There will be surges.
That is such a great and practical example of the importance of prioritization and why focus is so important. I know you talked about vision and focus, and I always like to say that vision will get you to the race, but its focus gets you across the finish line.
Yeah.
And I love that you're actually engaging your team and kind of measuring where are we and how do we get that utilization down so that we have some space to think. And I think that's a great way for you to think about capacity and use that to help ensure you have capabilities for growth. Tell me a little bit about innovation. I know you have worked in a number of organizations that thrive on innovation, and I'd like to know what you as a leader do to encourage innovation in your work teams.
Couple of dimensions and ideas. One, we talked earlier about the 10x. I think changing the boundaries and expanding the boundaries just allows or actually requires everyone to think different and come up with new ideas. So it's changing the boundaries and the context, stretch, just in the exercise. And then there's a whole bunch of tools and techniques I think can help. We spend a lot of time these days in front of a computer or in a small room or on a video conference. To me, it's not clear that these are the most expansive kind of platforms where you can actually innovate and have ideas. And therefore having the right like rooms set up, having boards you can write on the wall, it's visible to other people, or having techniques that are earlier on more expensive. And it's, everyone knows, creativity and innovation in the earlier stages are all about quantity, just getting all the quantity out and then later be restrictive, and having a process where everyone understands that that's the process. So there are a lot of these tools and techniques to do that. And then there's also an element, I think, in the culture, particularly around risk-taking, because with innovation, there is risk in terms of will it succeed? And innovation, you will know only after a certain while. So initially you invest in the ideas and then you funnel it down, you start doing it. You still haven't delivered whatever you do, created the product or made a deal or achieved this quarter's revenue because you're innovating. And I think allowing that to happen, giving people the time, but also that sometimes it will not work. And that's a cultural thing.
I really like that you're thinking about the environment in which people are working that can foster innovation. Because sometimes we think about it just as something in someone's head. But the other thing that I'm thinking about is I'm struck by how often you come back to the theme of we. And even when you're describing innovation, it's not that genius in a room in the dark, but it's a group of people working together and being very divergent and then convergent in their thinking.
Yeah, I mean, there are amazing kind of innovators who kind of create things by themselves initially. I think there's a large set, and in very large complex context, as you drive it out, you anyway need to engage more broadly. So I think at the very diverse, you draw energy from others and ideas and they build on each other, and a diverse set of people and ideas to stimulate a lot more, especially in the earlier phases.
Now you mentioned energy. You're a busy guy. You've got leading a lot of growth. You're leading teams that are geographically dispersed. You have long days. How do you manage your own energy? And not just physical energy, but just mental energy.
Yeah, I like profiles, describe it to go in and to go out. Very much like in sports where you have high phases of high energy and then you also have the moment where you give yourself time to relax. So I like that mixed profile. So I like to go into work, but then also switch off. And when I switch off, I'm typically phone is down, and I do things that are not work related whatsoever. To pulse high, the other one is then pulse around certain milestones or events. Very much if you train for your triathlon and you want to achieve it, you ramp up to that, and probably the weeks after the triathlon, you take it a little easier. Mm-hmm. So it's the same here. If there's a specific achievement, product launch, it could be a quarter or a year end. It could be like we have I/O typically, which will showcase our products and our partnerships. And these are the anchors around you energize an outcome, and you spend time on that one, and then it allows you afterwards also to decompress, to rest, and to recharge.
That's a great example of the third rule of intelligent restraint, which is exert, then recover. And what I love about what you're describing is it's not of a steady state. It's about understanding that there are moments of intensity and really hard work, but that you then compensate and recover. I think that's really important as a leader.
Yeah, what is difficult for myself and for many folks that I work with is kind of because you need to make that switch almost within a day in your pattern to actually switch off, and that's still, I think, a challenge. What helps me is actually sports or running, because I can turn the brain down to a level where it focuses on the task at hand, and that's already challenging. That is a tool for me. There are many other tools. So my experience also with my teams is everyone needs to find their habit, their routine, to use your language, and just apply it systematically to kind of switch off, to allow this high energy, low energy kind of change happening.
And do you teach your team how to do that, or what's your role in that?
The first one is role modeling. They want to hear and see what I'm doing and if it works, and I'm also not perfect, and also partially the challenges with that. And then to create space for it, and we're stimulating in the team and stipulating it. So currently we're running something called Well-Being Bingo, where everyone has a bingo card and with their own objectives and things on it, and some things are best practices that we think are good. And so that we foster an environment where we have gamification, there's a purpose, there's a we, because we do it together, we play bingo and everyone wins.
I love that. And so is it a physical a bingo card? Or is it electronic?
I mean, it's some people might have printed it out and it's physical, but it's obviously it's on a one-pager.
Okay, I love that.
It's 5 times 5.
And then so anytime if I see you doing one of those things, you get a point.
Yeah, I give actually, this is more trusty. You can give yourself points, and it's very open. You can share your bingo card with whoever you want to, but you can also keep it to yourself.
Okay, that's great.
And obviously, as a leader and role modeling, you start sharing your cards, and the expectation is not that you fill everything in. You can also show some things that are red where you're struggling with.
That's great. I have one last question for you. As you're clearly a growth leader and you've led growth. You lead leaders who are also leading growth. How do you identify someone that you think is a growth leader?
I look at 3 things. First and foremost, it's somebody who's externally anchored. I mean, that's very important in a market with customers or an external ecosystem, and then has a growth mindset, which engages in thinking about opportunities or what it could be. So in that sense, being not very mindful into today, but more forward-looking in this moment. The second trait I'm looking for is ability to execute, and do that also in very ambiguous kind of context. And you could see that in resumes, you can hear stories about it. So that one, even if you don't know a person that deep, it's relatively easy to kind of distill. And the third one is something which we talked earlier, is about scaling. Because you need to do it with lots of people or a larger footprint to really drive a lot of growth. So that has to do with the people angle. So that's somebody who typically attracts and inspires strong talent and scales them through them.
That's really great. Well, it's been wonderful talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Many thanks to Joachim for joining me today. Don't miss the next episode of Growth Leaders, where I speak to Tomas Chamorro-Premusik, psychologist, author, and entrepreneur who currently serves as the Chief Talent Officer at Manpower. I'm Allison Eyring. Thanks for listening. If you like what you hear, please subscribe to Growth Leaders wherever you get your podcasts. Leave a comment and a rating. We'd love to hear what you think.